An old adage, an old saying, has it that what people do not know will not hurt them. Like most old adages, this claim, I think, is somewhat suspect. What men and women don't know frequently hurts them, even though the claim to the contrary can appeal for support to yet another old saying, namely, ignorance is bliss. Yet I want to suggest today that more hurtful and even less likely to be a source of bliss than what people do not know is what people most assuredly do know, but which just ain't so. Now, what do I mean by that admittedly ungrammatical expression, knowing what just ain't so? Well, some examples. Everybody knows that the lines, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well," are taken from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Everybody just knows that Sherlock Holmes was given to muttering, "Elementary, my dear Watson." Everybody knows that Cinderella wore glass slippers to the handsome prince's ball. Well, unfortunately, what everybody just knows ain't so. If you check in Hamlet, you'll find that the relevant lines read, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him Horatio." Again, if you plough through the 4 novels and 56 short stories that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle penned about his famous detective, you will not find the phrase "Elementary, my dear Watson" even once. And as for Cinderella's slippers, well, the old French text of the tale has it that the slippers were made of vair, V-A-I-R, which means ermine, not vair, V-E-R-R-E, which means glass. The translator of the story, one Charles Perrault, made a mistake, and thereby condemned generations of thinking young readers to some bewilderment for precisely how the good lady managed to tinkle her way in glass slippers through several hours' enthusiastic dancing defies imagination. You tell people this, and they are somewhat upset, for they know that the contrary claims hold, even though in truth the claims just ain't so. In this address, I want to think with you about 2 widely accepted propositions frequently appealed to by opponents of the free market in the free society. Propositions widely regarded as being luminously self-evident. These propositions, I shall suggest to you, are to be numbered among those puzzling propositions that everybody knows, but that in truth just ain't so. The first proposition I'll look at has to do with profits. The second has to do with the allegedly exploitative nature of a free market economy. Now, in zeroing in on these 2 particular claims, I lay myself open to criticism. If you bother to peruse what critics of the free market in the free society are saying, you'll find yourself perhaps being reminded of the old tale of Heracles, or Hercules, call him what you will, doing battle with the Hydra. The Hydra, you will recall, was a monster with many heads. Poor Heracles would cut one off, and immediately from the stump 2 more heads would grow. So it seems very often with our critics. A claim is made against the market. The claim is explored, perhaps adequately answered, but is that the end of the matter? Oh no. 2 new claims pop up in its place. Hence, it could be argued by critics of the market that the 2 claims I explore with you today are not the real claims, the real objections to which they would, as it were, pin their support. But I do notice that the 2 particular claims I look at are rampant in much literature against the market being disseminated today, particularly, alas, in ecclesiastical circles. But let's move to the first proposition. The first proposition which I'm suggesting everybody knows, but which just ain't so. Everybody knows, or claims to know, that profits at the very best are an unfortunate feature of a market order, and at worst are evidence that consumers are paying much more for a good or a service than they need to pay, or in a sense should pay. I mean, you will notice that critics of the market rarely refer to profits without qualifying the word by some adjective. Adjectives such as mammoth or excessive or even obscene. You know, mammoth profits, obscene profits, on and on it goes. Again, if you amble through the city of New York, or any city for that matter, you will occasionally find scrawled upon walls the sentences, if sentences they be, people before profits, or production for people, not for profits. Sentences suggesting that somehow production for profit is anything but concerned about human beings, their needs, their wants. Again, you'll frequently find that defenders of a market economy attempt to reassure people by noting that if you break down the company dollar into, let's say, 100 cents, you'll find only a few of those cents represent profit. Perhaps you've seen the sort of diagram, the sort of the pie chart, the circle. And we're told that, goodness me, this much goes for raw materials, this much goes for wages to workers, this much goes for something else, and a tiny little sliver, say some 4 to 5 cents out of the 100 cents of the company dollars, a dollar represents profit. Hey, these people are saying, profits are bad, yes, but they're so small they can be ignored or perhaps tolerated. So the story goes. Now, I want to suggest to you today that behind this depicting of profit as something bad lies a picture, an image, an understanding of what profits are. And I think the picture goes something like this. Economic reality, so the story goes, begins with a producer. To produce some good, to provide some service, many things are needed. Raw materials are required. Machinery will be used. And of course, labor will be required. Now these, of course, involve the producer in certain costs, the costs of the raw materials, the cost of the depreciation of his machinery, the cost, that is, wages paid, to labor. And these three items, so it is suggested, give rise, as it were, to the price. The cost to consumers, if I can use those terms interchangeably for the moment, the price of the good, save something has to be added. To all these we get the add-on of profit. You see the picture. Here's the cost of the good. To this cost, this add-on, profit, that is sort of extracted by the producer from consumers. That's the story. It seems to me, if you and I give this a moment's thought, and that's perhaps somewhat demanding, for thought for some is difficult and a moment a very long time. If we think about this picture, its fallacious nature becomes clear. And indeed, the fallacy embodied in it is there right from the beginning. It's there in the starting point, that if you want to understand the formation of prices, you look, according to this picture, at the producer. In truth, I want to suggest, we look at the consumer first. And that moment, when a consumer exchanges money and forgoes other goods that money could have purchased to procure the good, the service that is being offered to the consumer through the marketplace. Now, to understand this, I'd like you to engage with me in a thought experiment. And I'd like you to pretend that you were the very, very first person who got the bright idea that maybe consumers would value disposable plastic garbage bags. I can remember, and maybe some here can remember, the bad old days before said disposable plastic garbage bags. One wrapped up garbage in newspaper, one put it in the trash can, and one had a horrible, soggy, smelly mess to cope with on the blessed day when the garbage collector called. But how you thought, maybe, just maybe, people would value this plastic lining they can put in, fill, pull out, tie up, get rid of that way. Now, what's the first question you're going to have to ask yourselves? Maybe that use of the definite article "the" is misleading, as you will have many, many questions. But I think one of the first questions you'll have to ask will be, what would consumers, in my opinion, be prepared to exchange for one of these disposable plastic garbage bags? Now, you might be tempted to put off that question, indeed avoid that question, by hot-footing it off to some government official, be he federal, state or local, and trying to get him on side to pass some law making the use of these bags mandatory and giving you, as it were, monopoly rights for producing the bags. I mean, do that and you can avoid a whole lot of difficult questions and demanding tasks. But let's suppose that government won't, as it were, get into the act with you, and you have to, as it were, dispose of, get rid of, sell your product in a free market economy. You come back to that question. What value would people ascribe to these bags, to the product I want to market? Would they, for example, be prepared to forego, I don't know, let's say the money they would pay for a decent paperback book, say $5.95, whatever. Well, forego that and procure one bag. Would they do that? You think not. Maybe you say that dying breed, in several senses named smokers, might be prepared to forgo one packet of cigarettes, say $1.50, $1.60, and procure a bag. They'd prefer that, rather than to, as it were, bypass the bag, forgo having the bag, and enjoy that one more packet of cigarettes. But no. You don't think that's right. If enough people are to purchase your product, you guess, maybe what they'd have to surrender would be what they have to surrender to buy an ice cream or something like that. Let's say 60 cents. You sort of guess that at that price, people will, as it were, surrender their 60 cents and other goods, services that 60 cents could purchase and procure a bag. They would value it at that sort of level. So you've started off, in other words, with what you think consumers would pay for your product. Then comes your second question. Can you produce that product for less than that cost? Now let's forget the in-between people and just do it directly. Can you, in other words, find some way that you can produce and market your disposable plastic garbage bags for less than that consumer-determined price? And you'll notice the lower you can make your manufacturing costs, the greater your profit will be. And maybe this gives us some insight into what a profit is. It's not the add-on that holds in this picture. Rather, profit can be thought of as a residual, as the difference between the consumer-determined price of the good and your costs of manufacturing, marketing, what have you. Now already something's at work. Because if you want to get the gap between selling price, production costs, marketing costs, what have you, as big as is possible so your profits are big, you'll be driven to seek out the most efficient way you can to manufacture your disposable plastic garbage bag. I mean, if you can get your production costs down to, let's say, 4 cents a bag, great! You have a 56-cent profit. Profit motive, if you want to call it that in other words, drives you, impels you, urges you, encourages you to find the least wasteful way you can to manufacture the good you wish to sell. The incentives are all there for you to avoid waste and reduce your production costs to a minimum. But more. Suppose you begin to register this large profit. 50 cents a bag, 56 cents a bag that you sell into your pocket. And what happens? The high profits you are earning encourage other producers to get into the act and to reduce, if you like, that selling price down so that the consumers will shift from you to this new source. Hey, someone might say, I'm prepared to sell for 50 cents. And your notoriously fickle customers say farewell to you, and off they go to someone else who is still making a very nice profit indeed, some 46 cents profit per bag. But the process goes on. And inexorably, the selling price goes down, down, down till it approximates to the marginal costs of production. Now this is why, incidentally, this picture can be tempting. For again and again, if you actually look at a market, you will find that goods do sell more or less, actually it's a little bit more, than that marginal cost of production, the cost of producing that one extra bag. That in fact the selling price approximates to that. But it does so not because this is how prices are generated, it does so because of this mechanism. Remember what it is. The consumer determines the price. He determines it by reference to his scale of values. You have to discover, can you produce it for less? Incidentally, if you couldn't, if the cost of producing a bag was 61 cents, the market is saying don't waste resources. This would be a monstrous misallocation of resources because the same raw materials, labour, what have you, could be used to produce other goods people do value more than this. It's saying not a goer. The market would be telling you that if you can't get below. But if you can get below, if in short you can increase, if you can sell at a profit, you'll be driven to find this most efficient way, and competition will start driving the price down, even if no other producer in fact gets into the market, the manufacturing of these plastic disposable bags. Why that? Simply because you want to keep the competition out. And to keep that competition out, you might say, hey, I'm going to lower my selling price. So the profit made by any competitor would be even less. May be reluctant to go for the capital investment needed, what have you. So long, in short, as competition is possible, so long as we have what some would call a contestable market, this drive generated by profit is at work. Let's just remind ourselves what it's doing. It's urging you and other producers to work out, to think out the most efficient, the least wasteful way you can to manufacture your product. And it's signaling other people to get into the act until the selling price is roundabout down to the marginal production costs. Now this signalling, this information-giving side of profits is very, very important indeed. For you see, if we use resources, raw materials, machinery, labour, to produce one good, to provide one service, it has a cost, namely an alternative use to which the same resources could be put. Well, how is a person to know where to deploy the resources at his or her disposal? How can a person know what it is that consumers value more, what they value less? And the answer to that notoriously difficult question, how do we deploy scarce resources, is given by profit rates. You see, suppose high profits are being made in some area at some time in the housing industry. That is signalling to producers to use resources to produce more housing rather than to deploy them in, I don't know, building a new shopping mall or providing a new cinema or some other service, some other use that is not valued as much by people. That's shown, remember, by the fact that that use leads to lower profits than this other use, the use of the materials to provide housing. The relative rates of profit, in other words, are telling people with resources they can invest one way or another how best to deploy those scarce resources. Now here, incidentally, lies the origin, the genesis of the horrors that are generated when a government gets into the act and tries to control prices and thereby modifies, alters, skews relative rates of profit. Since I referred to housing in our example, the example of a higher profit being made in housing than other uses, remember what that rate is saying? Come on, investors, go for housing. We'll use housing as our example. We're thinking, in short, about rent control. And I'm prepared to admit that at first sight, rent controls, that is, governments coercively preventing rents reaching the level that they would given an authentically free market economy, that this sort of intervention seems compassionate. I mean, isn't housing for the people much too important to be entrusted to the market and placed at the mercy of the allegedly monstrous profit motive? But what, in fact and in theory, has to happen when a government does intervene and starts, by coercion, skewing, distorting, altering relative rates of profit? Well, one can see with one's own eyes what happens when one gets on the train at Irvington and goes down to Grand Central, New York City. One passes apartment house after apartment house that is burnt out, that's vacant, that's run down, that's empty, even though one knows there's a serious shortage of housing in that community. And why has it happened? Well, the answer's clear. By interfering with the market and keeping profits in that area housing lower than they would be given the operation of a free market, the signals being given by relative rates of profit are hopelessly, utterly distorted. People with capital, people deploying resources, will put those resources in areas showing the higher profit, higher than the artificially low profit rate coming, as it were, from housing. Hey, it's more profitable to invest resources in areas other than housing, so the new cinemas are built, or the new shopping malls are put up, and housing, it suffers. The outcome, inevitable, given that the profit rate is less than that which would obtain in a free market. Inevitably, inexorably, a shortage occurs. And that's universal. Take an example from Sweden. During the Second World War, the Swedish government clamped on rent controls. At the end of the war, it was decided to leave those rent controls right where they were. The old line, housing for the people, too important to be entrusted to the market and the working of the profit motive. But inevitably, a shortage developed. The situation worsened. Gradually, the Swedish government began removing rent controls, letting rents find their market level, letting profits being made in the housing industry, and thereby more people deploying their resources to produce housing. And rapidly, the shortage, as it were, began to be eliminated. Indeed, one Swedish economist, for many years a supporter of the welfare state, put it very, very well indeed. Rent control, he asserted, is the most efficient way yet devised to destroy a city, save, he added, for bombing. Let me underscore again what rent control is. It's coercive interference by government in the market, which, by distorting the profitability of one industry relative to others, denies producers the information and the incentives which lead them to deploy the resources at their disposal in the way consumers in truth want them to deploy those very resources. You know, on this some years ago, Milton Friedman went out on a limb. He was involved in a discussion about the social responsibility of business, a very grandiose sounding thing. And Friedman stood up and he said, there is but one moral imperative that should direct the activities of those responsible for the behavior of a given firm, given industry. One and one only. And what's that imperative? His answer, increase your profits to the maximum possible. That's it. Many people hear this with horror. But just think for a moment of what that really means. One of the basic economic problems is really this. How can a group of people cooperatively working together, exchanging their skills, services, goods, what have you, how can people use what they've got to acquire what they want? That's a big problem for the reason I've already mentioned. That the wants are seemingly limitless, but the actual resources they have are limited. They have to choose. And it is vital that resources, raw materials, labour, machinery, what have you, are used to produce what consumers value more at the cost of what they value less, than providing them with what they value less, but at the cost of what they value more, and indeed what they value most. Now, how? How is a large industry, a large company, so to deploy the resources at its disposal? How does it know how to use these resources in the most efficient way, the least wasteful way, and also so they are used to produce what people value most at the cost of what they value least, rather than vice versa? The answer's simple. Seek out profit. For where the profits are at their maximum is where at that given time the community is demanding more of some good, some service than is available. And indeed, it's only by responding to this information that a company begins to deploy the resources at its disposal in the light of the very best information as to what consumers are wanting, needing, requiring, that is available. There's no other way. And indeed, it would seem to me, if part of behaving in a socially responsible way is seeing that those scarce goods that one does have some control on are used, so they are deployed in ways valued by our neighbours. To ignore this and to impose some arbitrary moral judgment as to what a company should be doing to be morally responsible is, I suggest, to ignore that best information available as to what consumers at a given time in a given place are wanting. It's saying what they want is irrelevant. My private moral judgments are the important ones. In a strange, ironic sort of way, the company directors who, by watching changing relative money prices in the market and keeping an eye on changing profit rates, redirect, steer, as it were, the company's resources by reference to that information. These are the people who are deploying the resources at their disposal in a socially responsible way. That is, in a way that is sensitive to the wants of the people the company allegedly exists to serve, and which in a free market it must serve if it is, quotes, to make a profit. As a matter of fact, on this subject, we needn't simply think in terms of the entrepreneurs and the capitalists, what have you. Suppose I'm an ordinary worker. I have only my labour to sell. Where do I sell it? How is it to be deployed? What specific labouring skill should I try to acquire so I can, as it were, offer my neighbours something they will value and for which they in turn will give me of their skills, the fruits of their toils? How do I know what to do? I look at relative wage rates. If a wage rate in one industry is higher than another, the market is saying, hey, we need more labour deployed here than here. If wage rates are free to drop, to go down, downward mobility in other words, that signal is saying, hey, don't deploy labour here. You look to see where wage rates are going up, deploy it here. An information system guaranteeing, if you will, guaranteeing is perhaps too strong, but giving us the best information we can have as to where labour should be deployed, so it is not being squandered and wasted. And therein lies, if you like, on the wage side, the parallel to rent control. For if wage rates are not free to move up or down in response to consumers buying and abstaining for buying, for that's what ultimately comes from, if you don't have that freedom, we'll be misallocating labour. And that's a monstrous thing to do, costing a community very dearly. Well, let me try and summarise. Profits, bad news. Not so. First, remembering that a profit is the distance or the difference between a consumer-determined price for some good or service and the costs of producing or providing that good or service. The producer is driven by the profit motive to find the most efficient way he can to produce the good, to provide the service that people value at a level hinted at by that money price. Secondly, the large profit rate signals to other producers to get into the act. And the selling price of the good, the service, is, as it were, forced down until it approximates, at the margin, to costs of production. And elaborating that final point, it is the profit motive, the search for profits, that enables those controlling the allocation of raw materials to use them in a way that provides people with the goods and the services they value most at the cost of alternative goods and services that they don't value as much as that. It is, to use that perhaps unfortunate expression, by pursuing the profit motive that a company shows the social responsibility that is so encouraged today. Profits, bad news. Everyone knows that. But alas, I'm suggesting what everybody claims to know, just, if you think about it, ain't so. Well, let's move to the second claim often made about the market, a claim people know is true, but which I'm going to suggest, again, just ain't so. This is the claim that a free market in a free society inevitably involves exploitation. Those who control capital will exploit men, women, with only their labour to sell. Businessmen, they'll exploit consumers by selling shoddy, faulty goods, cheating them. Employers, they'll exploit employees, setting a bare subsistence, if you like, remuneration rate for labour. The free market, exploitation. As a matter of fact, defenders of the market again concede this, just as defenders of the market apologise for profits by saying, hey, they're not too big, folks. So again and again you'll hear people allegedly defending a market economy sort of conceding this exploitation point. Hey, they say, yes, in defending the free market, I'm not really defending nasty, bad old laissez-faire capitalism, for I know, and we all know, that if it were not for regulation and kindly government intervention and the activities of trade unions that in a sense operate outside the law, if it were not for that, we'd have exploitation. No, it's not old laissez-faire capitalism I'm defending, it's reform capitalism. A sort of free market with kindly government there to prevent the excesses, to prevent the abuses, to stamp out, if you will, the exploitation. The defender, in other words, virtually concedes the point. But I'm wanting to suggest today that the basic claim, accepted at one level or another by opponents and some so-called defenders of the market, that the market of necessity inevitably will involve exploitation, is yet another of those quotes truths that just ain't so. Now I would like, in thinking about this, to look at three ways in which people have claimed that the market involves exploitation. And I want to start with the least important of these. Hey, someone says, everybody knows that businessmen will cheat consumers if they can get away with it. And really all I want to say about that is that, yes, there's no guarantee that a given businessman, or indeed a group of people combined together to constitute a business, will not try and cheat, steal if you like, if they can get away with it. There will be those who will do that. The market economy does presuppose, I believe, the rule of law. That is, laws prescribing violence, theft, and fraud. And that, to me, means that we need a government that will protect people from those realities, violence, theft, fraud, be it from an individual, from a mugger, a businessman, what have you. Adam Smith saw this, for in one famous passage where he's urging people to pursue their own interests, their own vision of the good life as they perceive it, he insists that so long as they operate within the laws of justice, they'll be forced, as it were, to realize an end they didn't intend, the well-being of their neighbors. In other words, right from the beginning, defenders of the market perceived that it did involve, had to involve, legal structures that precluded acts, be they by an individual or in a sense corporate acts, involving violence, theft, fraud. We need that. There's only one other thing I would suggest. First, a business that cheats and gets away with it, that sells shoddy merchandise, that fools consumers, is not going to remain in business very long. Once bitten, twice shy, one hopes. Word gets round. So a business that wants to stay in business has, if you like, an incentive to play honest with consumers. But even more, given a free market economy, alert entrepreneurs, in a sense, have perceived that people value information. Hence, certainly in Australia, and I imagine in this nation, there are many writers who earn a very pleasing income indeed, thank you, by seeking out horror stories of businesses that do somehow try to cheat or manage to get away with cheating the public. And they sell their stories off to newspapers, to journals, to television stations. Our version of 60 Minutes at Home delights when it can tell the story of some shonky business enterprise and have, as it were, dissatisfied, disgruntled consumers speaking their anger into the camera. So, the market does, I suggest, have certain inbuilt mechanisms that count against that sort of exploitation. And secondly, it does presuppose the rule of law protecting individuals from violence, theft, fraud, whether that violence, theft or fraud is initiated by a single person or some, quotes, corporation. On that then, nothing more, I think, need be said. I want to move, however, to two other versions of the story that a free market of necessity involves exploitation. And I want to begin with perhaps the best known and historically most significant version of this, the version elaborated by our good friend Karl Marx. Now on this, it's terribly important that we don't distort Marx unduly, simply because of limits of time. I'm going to have to try and keep the story that I'll be developing in a moment fairly brief. But I don't think I'll be distorting. And because of that, I want to just remind you that Karl Marx himself, in his serious writings, never said that the individual capitalist is an amoral or immoral person who's really out there to exploit, who enjoys exploiting, hurting his or her neighbours. He doesn't, in fact, focus on the individual at all. He talks only about the class, that the class of people controlling capital, he says, exploits the class of people with only their labour, their sweat, their toil, to sell. And as a matter of fact, he suggests that the exploiting capitalist is as much, or can be as much, a victim of this allegedly monstrous system as the exploited worker, the exploited person with only labour to sell. And indeed, he suggests that by overthrowing this system, one in a very real sense liberates the capitalist as well as the proletariat. Now this theme of Marx, this claim of Marx, has been picked up by many so-called liberation theologians or political theologians like, say, Jürgen Moltmann in Germany. They've taken this theme and they say, in advocating a socialist state, in advocating the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and a capitalist-centered society, we're striving to liberate all people, capitalist and proletariat alike. That's the story. So let's just make sure we don't distort Marx on that. So what's he saying? Basically he says this: the tragedy of capitalism, the most productive way a people can organize its economic activities to date, says Marx, the tragedy of it is that inevitably, inexorably, of necessity, it involves this coercion of one class of people by another. Now why? Now it goes back to something very, very simple. and it may seem quite innocuous. Indeed, it goes back to an idea that had its beginnings in the writings of Adam Smith and which was developed by Ricardo. It wasn't original with Marx. Marx was not a very original thinker. It goes back, if you will, to what is usually called the labour theory, some say analysis, but the labour theory of value and the theory of surplus value. Now, what is this theory? Begins, we can present it something like this. According to Marx, the producer, the manufacturer, the person responsible for providing a good or creating some sort of service has certain costs. We put them up before, but let's put them up again. There'll be the costs of raw materials. There'll be the cost of machinery and its depreciation. There'll be the cost of labour. Now, says Marx, the capitalist has to, or the industrialist, the producer, has to acquire these realities at their market price. He just can't make it up, says Marx. He was smart at that point. The producer will have to pay the market price of the raw materials. He'll have to, as it were, put aside a certain amount of money, so in time he's got enough to cover depreciation of his machinery. Again, market price. And of course, labour. He'll have to pay wages at the market price of labour. On this one, Marx was smarter than some other critics of capitalism who get this wrong, suggesting that the employer sets the price of labour at whim, caprice. Now, imagine, let's take a concrete case, that you're producing not some abstract good. Let's say you're the manufacturer, you're the capitalist, what have you, responsible for producing billiard balls. And let's say you, by taking on one more worker, can produce 10, or he can produce 10 billiard balls an hour. You can sell these in the market at $10 each, that is, at $100. Market price. Go back. Maybe the market price, says Marx, of the raw materials that go into making those billiard balls is $40. Let's say. Maybe by setting aside $5 for every hour the machinery is used, you will in time accumulate enough money to replace that machinery when it's worn out. In other words, $5 per hour, all of this is per hour, covers the depreciation of your machinery. And let's say, let's be generous, that the market price, the market determined wage rate you have to pay your employee, this one employee, is $5 an hour. Now, says Marx, I'm puzzled. For it's clear that you're using things that have values. This is how he would put it. And he would say the value that goes into producing these should equal the value that comes out. It can't just magically appear from nowhere. But look, if we express value in terms of money price, you've got to do a few more moves there, but let's just keep it at this level, we'll find $50. The value, as represented by the money price, that goes in, $50. But the value that comes out, $100. Now, all of these are determined at the market rate. There's been no sort of cheating, no theft in any sort of sneaky sense. This is all within the market, this has happened. And from where, says Marx, does this extra $50, seeing that as a measure of value, if you will, from whence does it come? It had to come from somewhere. Well, says Marx, it clearly didn't come from the raw materials. Why not? The answer is that the raw materials still exist. Little fragments on the factory floor, but the bulk of it in the billiard balls. Say it's ivory. The ivory's still there. It's in the billiard balls or little fragments of ivory on the factory floor. So you can't say that this $50 surplus value comes from the raw material. Comes from the machinery. No, says Marx, you've covered that. $5 an hour put aside will in time enable you to replace your machinery when it runs out. You've calculated it correctly. Not from machinery. Only one factor is left. Labour. Labour, says Marx, is the sole source of value. But who gets the surplus value? Answer, the capitalist. He has to if he wants to stay in business, because that's where other producers are moving in. So, value is created by labour, but labour doesn't get what it creates. It's expropriated. This surplus value is expropriated, taken, pocketed by the capitalist, and he has to if he's to stay in business. So, says Marx, exploitation of labour by the capitalist is inevitable. Well, what's wrong with this? The answer, folk, is that everything is wrong. And in fact, if you read Marx, both Das Kapital, first and the last volume, and you read a fascinating study by Marx on labour theories of value, Marx himself sees some of the massive problems. I mean, the first one he looks at, a pretty obvious one, is that just to talk of labour like that is a bit misleading. After all, there's a difference between skilled labour and unskilled labour. If you've got me to do some carpentry, or you've got a trained carpenter to do it, very different output. So to make up for differences between specific labourers, Marx begins to talk about what he calls socially necessary labour. And what does he mean by that? Well, maybe we can answer that question by tiptoeing up. Suppose, let's go back to me, the carpenter. I get some lovely pine, and saw, hammer, nails, what have you, and I try and make dog's kennel, a birdhouse, whatever. It'll be a mess, a horrible, horrible mess, but I may have invested hours and hours of sweat and toil into producing this good that no person in his or her right mind would value, would want. Hey, I say to Marx, surely according to your theory, my labour, after all, labour's the only source of value, has produced something of value. But I try it in the market, hey, no one wants it. Someone else put it this way, I think it was Leonard Reed. He once said, I may invest as much toil and sweat and labour into producing mud pies as somebody invests in producing meat pies. If I think that because same amount of labour, same value in the market, I'm soon going to get one hell of a shock when I take my little mud pies out and attempt to sell them. Useless. But that doesn't faze Marx. Hey, says Marx, labour, effort, toil, sweat, that is spent producing goods that nobody values doesn't count as labour. In other words, socially necessary labour only includes the labour producing things that people value. As a matter of fact, he goes further. He says, and what if you produce too many of these things? What if there's a glut? He says, that doesn't count either. We will only count as labour that work, if you will, producing goods that people value in the market-determined quantities people want. Whatever clears the market, that's it. Any labour producing goods above that level, not labour at all. But what's happened? It looked an interesting statement that labour produces value. I mean, it looked interesting. But now we find that labour is being defined in a special way. We could read it, labour producing goods people value, this whole complex thing produces labour producing goods that people value produces value. And all of a sudden we realise it's empty. The term is there, the term's on the other side. It's about as silly as saying, well, suppose I said to you, all animals have 2 legs. Hey, someone says, you're wrong. They point to a dog. Oh, I say, I don't count that as an animal. By animal, I mean a critter with 2 legs. So what am I now saying? Critters with 2 legs, that's what I mean by animal, have 2 legs. By saying one is one. Red things are red. It's a tautology. It's empty. It's vacuous. Now we could go on and on about this. But as a matter of fact, we don't have to. For in fighting the so-called labour theory of value and the theory of surplus value, the theories that lie behind Marx's notion that given the capitalist mode of production, inevitably, inexorably, those controlling capital will exploit those with only their labour to sell. In looking at this theory, we're looking at a theory that the most interesting of contemporary Marxists are dropping. A theory that the best Marxian thinkers, and they're the only ones that should interest us, are conceding has had its day. Look, I just mentioned 2 names. G.A. Cowan, a very interesting Marxian thinker who works at Oxford University. Or John Elster, Jon Elster, a brilliant theoretician who divides his time between the University of Chicago, where he works for some 6 months a year, and the Institute for Social Research in Oslo. Both these thinkers say quite categorically that if we're to defend Marxism today, if we're to defend classical Marxian thought, we have to phase out, drop as clearly inadequate and as totally wrong Marx's labour theory of value. Check it in just one work of John Elster's. The volume is entitled Making Sense of Marx. It was published by Cambridge University Press in association with the Institute for the Study of the Humanities in Paris. It's a massive volume. And in that volume, in a lengthy section utterly demolishing the labour theory of value, Elster says, this theory, and I quote, is useless at its best, dangerous at its not infrequent worst. As a matter of fact, in a shorter book that he published in 1987, a book simply called Karl Marx, An Introduction, Elster simply states, categorically states, Marxian economics is dead. Hence, in fighting this, we are, in a sense, fighting a straw man. The Marxian rootage, the Marxian basis for saying that the capitalist mode of production inevitably involves exploitation is crazy. As a matter of fact, it is so totally wrong on its theory of value that one further aside is necessary. You see, you and I are fortunate. We live on what we could call the far side of the marginalist revolution. Marx wrote just before this. Now, what was the marginalist revolution? Full answer is impossible, but one critical factor related to this very idea of value about which Marx talks.